The sound of Colonel Marcus Hayes hitting the concrete echoed across the training facility like a gunshot. One moment he was reaching for Jessica Thompson's M4 carbine with that familiar smirk of authority. The next he was clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in shock and pain. What happened in those 3 seconds would become legendary at Fort Braxton. But the real story began 6 months earlier in a small Tennessee garage where Jessica Thompson had no idea her life was about to change forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jessica Thompson had grease permanently embedded under her fingernails and calluses on her palms that told the story of 8 years fixing engines in her family's auto repair shop. At 26, she could diagnose a transmission problem by sound alone and rebuild a carburetor blindfolded, skills that earned respect from the truckers and farmers who brought their vehicles to Thompson's garage in Millerville, Tennessee. Her world consisted of hydraulic lifts, socket wrenches, and the satisfaction of machines that ran perfectly after she worked her magic on them. The morning everything changed started like any other. Jessica arrived at the shop before sunrise, coffee in hand, ready to tackle Mrs. Henderson's stubborn Chevy and the delivery truck that had been making concerning noises. The familiar scent of motor oil and the hum of fluorescent lights created the soundtrack of her predictable existence. She wore the same navy work coveralls, tied her auburn hair back in the same practical ponytail, and approached each repair with the same methodical precision that had made her indispensable to her father's business. Her routine was interrupted when her younger brother Danny burst through the shop's side door, his face flushed with excitement and a manila envelope clutched in his hands. Danny had always been the dreamer in the family, the one who talked about adventure while Jessica kept her feet firmly planted in reality. He joined the Army Reserves 3 years earlier, partly for the college benefits and partly to satisfy his need for something bigger than small-town life. "Jess, you have to see this," Danny said, practically bouncing on his feet as he waved the envelope. "Remember how you're always saying you wish you could do something more meaningful than fixing the same broken-down trucks every day?" Jessica looked up from the engine she'd been examining, raising an eyebrow at her brother's enthusiasm. Danny's excitement was often infectious, but she'd learned to be cautious about his grand ideas. The last time he'd been this animated, he'd convinced her to help him build a treehouse that collapsed spectacularly 2 weeks later. "What's got you all worked up now?" she asked, wiping her hands on a shop rag. Danny opened the envelope and pulled out an official-looking document with the Army Reserve letterhead. "They're starting a new program for civilians with mechanical aptitude, advanced technical training that could lead to specialized roles in military engineering and logistics. They want people who can think on their feet and aren't afraid to get their hands dirty." Jessica frowned, scanning the document he thrust toward her. The program description mentioned intensive training at Fort Braxton, North Carolina, with opportunities for advancement into specialized technical roles within the reserve system. It sounded impressive but also completely outside her comfort zone. "Danny, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not soldier material," she said, handing the papers back to him. "I fix things that are broken. I don't break things for a living." "That's exactly why you'd be perfect for this," Danny insisted. "They need people who understand how systems work, who can solve problems under pressure. Think about it, Jess. When old Mr. Patterson's tractor broke down during harvest season and he was about to lose his entire corn crop, who figured out how to jury-rig a solution with spare parts from 3 different machines?" Jessica remembered that day clearly. She'd worked 14 hours straight, improvising solutions and adapting components that were never meant to work together. The satisfaction of hearing that engine roar back to life had been unlike anything she'd experienced in routine repair work. "That's different," she protested. "That was just problem solving with familiar equipment. And what do you think military engineering is?" Danny countered. "Look, I'm not saying you have to make it a career. It's just a 6-month training program. If you complete it, you'll have skills that could open doors you've never even considered. Plus they pay you while you train." Jessica found herself actually considering the possibility. She'd been feeling restless lately, as if her carefully ordered life was missing something she couldn't quite identify. The garage ran itself most days, and while she took pride in her work, there was a nagging sense that she was capable of more than endless oil changes and brake repairs. "Where did you even get this information?" she asked, stalling for time while her mind processed the implications. My unit commander mentioned it during our last drill weekend, Danny explained. He said they're specifically looking for people with mechanical backgrounds who might not have considered military service before. When I told him about your skills, he said you'd be exactly the kind of person they want. Jessica walked over to the shop's small office area and poured herself another cup of coffee, buying time to think. The familiar surroundings of the garage suddenly felt both comforting and confining. She'd inherited her father's skill with machines, but maybe she'd also inherited his tendency to play it safe, to stick with what was known and predictable. What's the training actually involve? She asked finally. Danny's face lit up as he realized she was seriously considering it. Basic military protocols, advanced mechanical systems, some leadership development. The interesting part is they integrate everything with real-world scenarios. Instead of just classroom theory, you're working on actual equipment under pressure. And after 6 months, options, Danny said simply, you could come back here with advanced certifications that would let you work on military contracts. You could continue with the reserves and potentially move into specialized roles. Or you could use the experience and training to pivot into entirely different career paths. Jessica stared out the shop's front window at Main Street, where the same pickup trucks drove by.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
At the same times every day, Mrs. Patterson would be by at 10:30 for her weekly grocery run. The mail truck would pass at exactly 11:15. The predictability that had once felt secure now seemed limiting. I'd have to leave the shop for 6 months, she said, more to herself than to Danny. Dad's been talking about retiring anyway, but I'm not sure he's ready to handle everything alone. Actually, Danny said with a grin, I already talked to him about that. He thinks it's a great idea, says it's time you saw more of the world than the inside of engine compartments. Jessica turned to stare at her brother. You discussed this with Dad before talking to me. I wanted to make sure all the practical objections were addressed before I brought it up, Danny explained. Dad's been worried that you're too comfortable here, that you're not pushing yourself to grow. He sees this as an opportunity for you to discover what you're really capable of. The comment stung a little because Jessica suspected it might be true. She'd been so focused on mastering her current skills that she'd stopped challenging herself to learn new ones. The garage represented security and expertise, but maybe it also represented a ceiling she'd been afraid to push against. I don't know anything about military culture, she admitted. I've never even been camping, let alone dealt with drill sergeants and combat training. That's why it's called training, Danny pointed out. They don't expect you to arrive knowing everything. They expect you to arrive willing to learn. Jessica read through the application materials more carefully, noting the emphasis on problem-solving ability and mechanical aptitude rather than prior military experience. The program seemed designed specifically for people like her, civilians with specialized skills who could bring fresh perspectives to military challenges. The application deadline is next week, Danny added, sensing her wavering resolve. If you're going to do this, you need to decide soon. That evening, Jessica sat on her front porch with a beer and the application packet, watching the sun set over the Tennessee hills. Her life here was comfortable, predictable, and safe. She knew exactly what tomorrow would bring, and next week, and probably next year. There was something appealing about that certainty, but also something suffocating. She thought about Mrs. Henderson's Chevy, which would need the same repair again in 6 months, because the real problem was that the whole system was outdated and inefficient. Maybe her own life had become like that, functional but not optimal, running on patterns that had worked in the past but weren't serving her future. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Carla, who worked as a nurse in Nashville. Heard Danny trying to talk you into joining the army. Sounds terrifying and amazing. When do you leave? Jessica laughed despite herself. Carla had always been the one to push her out of her comfort zone, the one who'd convinced her to try rock climbing, and take that pottery class and go on the disastrous blind date with the accountant, who collected vintage lunchboxes. Most of Carla's suggestions ended badly, but they always ended with good stories, and the satisfaction of having tried something new. She picked up a pen and began filling out the application. By the time the sun disappeared behind the hills, Jessica Thompson had officially applied for the Army Reserve Advanced Technical Training Program. She had no idea that this decision would eventually lead to a confrontation with Colonel Marcus Hayes that would test every assumption about what she was capable of achieving. 3 weeks later, Jessica received her acceptance letter along with reporting instructions for Fort Braxton, North Carolina. She would begin training in 60 days, which gave her just enough time to arrange coverage for the garage and convince herself that she wasn't making the biggest mistake of her life. The night before her departure, her father took her aside for one of their rare serious conversations. "Your mother would be proud," he said simply. "She always said you had more potential than you realized, but that you needed something to push you toward it." Jessica hugged him tightly, suddenly understanding that this wasn't just about her own growth. It was about honoring the dreams her mother had encouraged before cancer took her 5 years earlier. Her mother had always talked about the importance of discovering what you were truly capable of not letting fear keep you from finding out how far your abilities could take you. As Jessica packed her few belongings into her pickup truck the next morning, she had no idea that 6 months later she would be standing in a combat training facility, facing down a colonel who was about to make the mistake of underestimating exactly what Jessica Thompson was capable of when pushed to her limits. The drive to Fort Braxton took 6 hours. 6 hours of increasing anxiety mixed with anticipation. Jessica had never been further from home than Atlanta, and the idea of spending half a year in a completely unfamiliar environment with people she'd never met felt both thrilling and terrifying. Fort Braxton appeared through her windshield like a small city dedicated entirely to military precision. American flags snapped in the Carolina breeze, and the distant sound of training exercises created a constant background rhythm that was unlike anything from her civilian experience. Guard posts, administrative buildings, and training facilities stretched as far as she could see, all organized with the kind of systematic efficiency that her mechanical mind found oddly appealing. At the Visitor Processing Center, Jessica joined a line of other new arrivals, most of whom looked as uncertain as she felt. The group was more diverse than she'd expected, men and women of various ages and backgrounds, united only by their apparent nervousness and the manila folders containing their orders. "First time on a military base?" asked a woman standing behind her in line. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with the kind of confident posture that suggested prior military experience. "Is it that obvious?" Jessica replied with a self-conscious smile. "You're looking around like you're trying to memorize everything for a test later," the woman said with a friendly grin. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Kim, transitioning from active duty to the reserve program." "You are?" Jessica Thompson, complete civilian trying not to embarrass herself too badly. "Don't worry about it. The best thing about reserve training is that they expect you to start from zero. They're more interested in your willingness to learn than what you already know." As they moved through the processing line, Jessica felt some of her anxiety beginning to fade. The administrative procedures were thorough but straightforward, and the staff seemed genuinely interested in helping new arrivals get oriented rather than intimidating them. Her assigned barracks was a modern facility that reminded her more of a college dormitory than the harsh military accommodations she'd imagined. Her roommate was Alex Rivera, a former restaurant manager from Phoenix who joined the program, hoping to transition into military logistics coordination. "So what's your story?" Alex asked as they unpacked their belongings. "What made you decide to trade civilian life for 6 months of people telling you what to do?" Jessica found herself explaining about the garage, her growing sense of restlessness, and her brother's encouragement to try something completely different. As she talked, she realized that her motivations were clearer than she'd thought. This wasn't just about career advancement or new experiences. It was about discovering whether she had capabilities beyond what her safe, predictable life had required her to develop. "That's cool," Alex said. "I got tired of managing restaurant drama and wanted to do something that felt more meaningful. My dad served in the Navy, and he always said military logistics was like running a restaurant, just with higher stakes and better job security." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. A tall, athletic woman in army fatigues stood in the hallway, her posture radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from years of military experience. "Ladies, I'm Sergeant First Class Bobby Chen, and I'll be your primary instructor for the duration of this program. I wanted to introduce myself before tomorrow's official orientation and answer any immediate questions you might have." Sergeant Chen had the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Her uniform was immaculate, her bearing confident but approachable. When she spoke, her voice carried the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard and understood the first time. "This program is designed to challenge you in ways you probably haven't been challenged before," she continued. "We're not trying to turn you into infantry soldiers. We're trying to help you discover leadership and technical capabilities that you might not know you possess. The next 6 months will push you beyond what you think you're capable of, but that's how you find out what you're actually capable of." Jessica found herself studying Sergeant Chen's demeanor, noting the way she communicated complex ideas simply and directly. There was something inspiring about her confidence, the sense that she'd earned her authority through competence rather than just rank. "Any questions before tomorrow's chaos begins?" Sergeant Chen asked. "What should we expect from the training?" Jessica asked. "I mean, what does a typical day look like?" "There are no typical days in this program," Sergeant Chen replied with a slight smile. "That's intentional. We want you to learn how to adapt, solve problems, and perform under varying conditions. Some days you'll be in classrooms learning theory. Other days you'll be in the field applying what you've learned to real scenarios. The goal is to keep you slightly off balance so you develop the flexibility to handle unexpected challenges." After Sergeant Chen left, Jessica and Alex spent the evening exploring the base and getting oriented to their new environment. The scale of Fort Braxton was impressive, but what struck Jessica most was the sense of purpose that seemed to permeate everything. People moved with direction and focus, as if everyone understood their role in a larger mission. That night, lying in her narrow bunk and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of military life around her, Jessica felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about what the next 6 months would bring. She had no way of knowing that her biggest challenge wouldn't come from the rigorous training or demanding physical requirements. It would come from Colonel Marcus Hayes, a man who was about to make assumptions about Jessica Thompson that would prove to be spectacularly wrong. The first week of training at Fort Braxton shattered every preconceived notion Jessica had about military life. Rather than the harsh, screaming drill sergeant environment she'd expected from movies, the Advanced Technical Training Program operated more like an intensive graduate school, with a strong emphasis on practical application. The days began at 0500 hours with physical fitness training that challenged her body in ways 8 years of manual labor hadn't. But the real learning started after breakfast. Sergeant Chen led their group of 24 trainees through a curriculum that blended mechanical engineering, logistics coordination, leadership development, and systems analysis. The classroom work was demanding but fascinating, covering everything from advanced hydraulic systems to supply chain management in complex operational environments. Jessica discovered that her years of diagnosing mechanical problems had given her an intuitive understanding of how systems functioned under stress, a skill that translated surprisingly well to military applications. During their third week, the program introduced field exercises designed to test their ability to apply classroom knowledge under pressure. Jessica found herself assigned to a team tasked with establishing a forward maintenance facility using limited resources and equipment that seemed deliberately chosen to be incompatible. Her teammates included Alex Rivera, whose restaurant management background proved invaluable for organizing workflows, and Private Marcus Webb, a former electrician from Detroit, whose technical skills complemented Jessica's mechanical expertise. The exercise took place in a simulated combat environment, complete with time pressures, resource constraints, and unexpected complications introduced by the training staff. Jessica initially felt overwhelmed by the military terminology and protocols, but as the exercise progressed, she began to recognize familiar patterns. Equipment failures, Supply shortages and coordination challenges weren't fundamentally different from the problems she'd solved at Thompson's garage, just on a larger scale with higher stakes. When their assigned generator failed 3 hours into the exercise, leaving the team without power for essential equipment, Jessica approached the problem with the same systematic methodology she'd use on a broken transmission. She traced through the electrical systems, identified the failure point, and improvised a repair using components scavenged from other non-essential equipment. The solution wasn't elegant, but it worked, and their maintenance facility came online ahead of schedule. Outstanding problem solving, Thompson, Sergeant Chen observed as she reviewed the team's performance. You approached an unfamiliar system with confidence, and adapted your existing knowledge to find a practical solution. That's exactly the kind of thinking this program is designed to develop. Jessica felt a flush of pride at the recognition, but more importantly, she felt a growing sense that she belonged in this environment. The combination of technical challenges and leadership responsibilities engaged parts of her mind that had been dormant during her years of routine mechanical work. She was learning not just new skills, but new ways of thinking about problems and solutions. The program's structure encouraged collaboration and mutual support among trainees, and Jessica found herself gravitating toward others who shared her practical, solution-oriented mindset. She developed a particular friendship with David Park, a former software engineer, who joined the program hoping to transition into military cybersecurity roles. Their late-night discussions in the barracks often centered on the similarities between debugging code and diagnosing mechanical problems, both requiring systematic analysis and creative problem-solving. You know what I like about this place, David said one evening as they reviewed technical manuals in preparation for the next day's exercises. Nobody cares about your background or where you came from. They only care about whether you can do the job when it matters. Jessica nodded, thinking about how different this environment was from civilian workplaces where politics and personalities often mattered more than competence. Here, performance was measured by objective standards, and respect was earned through demonstrated ability rather than social connections or institutional history. As the weeks progressed, Jessica began to notice that her mechanical intuition was developing into something broader and more sophisticated. The military's systematic approach to analyzing complex systems was enhancing her natural diagnostic abilities, giving her frameworks for understanding not just how individual components functioned, but how they interacted within larger operational contexts. She was becoming more than just a skilled mechanic. She was developing into a systems thinker. The fourth month of training introduced leadership rotations, where trainees took turns managing team exercises and coordinating multi-group projects. Jessica initially felt uncomfortable with the formal authority that came with these assignments, but she discovered that her instinct for collaborative problem-solving translated well to leadership situations. Instead of simply issuing orders, she found herself facilitating discussions, identifying team members' strengths, and creating environments where everyone could contribute their best work. During a particularly challenging logistics exercise, Jessica was assigned as team leader for a scenario involving the rapid deployment of maintenance capabilities to support a simulated humanitarian mission. The exercise required coordinating resources across multiple teams, managing competing priorities, and adapting to constantly changing requirements introduced by the training staff. Jessica approached the challenge by first gathering information from all team members about their capabilities and concerns, then developing a flexible plan that could accommodate likely variations in requirements and resource availability. When the inevitable complications arose, her team was able to adapt quickly because everyone understood not just their specific roles, but the overall objectives and decision-making framework. Exceptional leadership performance, Sergeant Chen noted in her evaluation. Thompson demonstrated the ability to balance directive leadership when decisions were needed with collaborative leadership when team input was valuable. Her team consistently performed above expectations because she created an environment where individual strengths could contribute to collective success.
Recognition felt gratifying.
But what Jessica valued more was the growing confidence she felt in her ability to handle complex, high-pressure situations. She was discovering capabilities she'd never known she possessed, not just in technical areas, but in communication, coordination, and strategic thinking. As training moved into its final months, the exercises became more sophisticated and demanding. Jessica found herself thriving in environments that would have intimidated her 6 months earlier, approaching new challenges with curiosity rather than anxiety. The combination of technical knowledge, practical experience, and leadership development had transformed not just her skills, but her entire conception of what she was capable of achieving. During a night exercise designed to test their ability to maintain operations under adverse conditions, Jessica's team encountered a series of equipment failures that threatened to shut down their entire mission. Working by flashlight in near-freezing temperatures, she systematically diagnosed and resolved problems that ranged from hydraulic leaks to electrical shorts, keeping essential systems operational while other teams struggled with similar challenges. "How did you know to check the backup pressure regulators?" Alex asked as they completed the exercise successfully ahead of schedule. "Same principle as troubleshooting a stubborn carburetor," Jessica explained. "When the obvious solutions don't work, you start looking at the components that everyone assumes are functioning correctly. Usually, that's where you find the real problem." The exercise debriefing highlighted her team's superior performance, but Jessica was more interested in the feedback about her individual development. According to Sergeant Chen's assessment, she had evolved from a competent technician into a resourceful leader who could maintain operational effectiveness under challenging conditions. "Thompson has exceeded all program expectations," the evaluation read. "She demonstrates exceptional technical competence, innovative problem-solving abilities, and natural leadership instincts. Recommend for advanced training opportunities and consideration for specialized roles requiring independent judgment and operational flexibility." Reading those words, Jessica realized that the restless dissatisfaction she'd felt at Thompson's garage had been replaced by something much more energizing. She wasn't just learning new skills, she was discovering a version of herself that she'd never known existed. The person who had been content fixing the same types of problems in the same small garage was evolving into someone who thrived on complexity, uncertainty, and the challenge of finding solutions under pressure. But her transformation was about to face its greatest test. In the program's final month, all trainees would rotate through specialized training modules designed to expose them to different military specialties and identify areas where their skills might be most effectively utilized. One of these rotations would place Jessica under the direct supervision of Colonel Marcus Hayes, commander of Fort Braxton's Elite Combat Training Division. Colonel Hayes had built his reputation on demanding perfection from personnel under his command and maintaining the highest standards of military discipline and performance. He was known for his tactical expertise, his attention to detail, and his unwillingness to accept anything less than excellence from the soldiers in his programs. He was also known for his skepticism about the reserve training program and his belief that civilian-trained personnel lacked the mental toughness and institutional commitment required for serious military roles. What Colonel Hayes didn't know was that Jessica Thompson had spent the last 5 months discovering exactly how much mental toughness and commitment she possessed when properly challenged. He was about to make assumptions about her capabilities that would prove to be spectacularly incorrect. The rotation assignments were posted on a Friday afternoon, and Jessica discovered she would spend the following week in Colonel Hayes's Advanced Tactical Training module. The program description mentioned intensive instruction in combat marksmanship, tactical movement and operational decision-making under pressure, which sounded both exciting and intimidating. "You got Hayes," David observed, reading over her shoulder. "I've heard he's tough but fair. Supposedly one of the best tactical instructors in the Army, but he doesn't suffer fools gladly." "What does that mean exactly?" Jessica asked. "It means he'll push you harder than you've been pushed so far, but if you can meet his standards you'll learn more in a week than most people learn in a year," Alex added. "Just don't take anything personally. His job is to find out what you're made of." That evening, Jessica spent extra time in the base fitness center, partly to prepare physically for what promised to be a demanding week, and partly to work off the nervous energy that came with anticipating a new challenge. She'd grown comfortable with Sergeant Chen's teaching style, and the collaborative environment of the main program, but rotation weeks were designed to push trainees outside their comfort zones and expose them to different military cultures and expectations. As she worked through her exercise routine, Jessica reflected on how much she'd changed since arriving at Fort Braxton. The woman who had been nervous about leaving her small-town garage was gone, replaced by someone who looked forward to new challenges as opportunities for growth rather than threats to avoid. She'd developed physical fitness, technical expertise and leadership confidence that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. But she'd also developed something less tangible but equally important, a sense of her own resilience and adaptability. The training program had repeatedly placed her in unfamiliar situations and asked her to perform under pressure, and she'd consistently found ways to meet those challenges successfully. That track record of success under stress had given her confidence that she could handle whatever Colonel Hayes' program might demand. On Monday morning, Jessica reported to the Combat Training Complex Alpha, a facility that looked significantly more serious and militarized than the classroom and field exercise areas where she'd spent most of her training. The buildings were designed for functionality rather than comfort, and the personnel moved with the kind of focused intensity that suggested this was where theory became practice. Colonel Marcus Hayes was exactly what Jessica had expected from a career military officer with a reputation for demanding excellence. Tall, impeccably groomed, and radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of leadership in high-stakes environments, he conducted the initial orientation with military precision, and no unnecessary pleasantries. This rotation will evaluate your potential for roles requiring tactical competence and operational independence, he announced to the group of 8 trainees assigned to his program. Some of you may have performed adequately in classroom and basic field exercises, but combat-related specialties require capabilities that cannot be developed through academic study or simulated scenarios. His gaze swept across the group, pausing briefly on each trainee with an evaluative intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. When his eyes reached Jessica, she sensed a moment of particular scrutiny, as if he was making initial assessments about her likely performance based on factors she couldn't identify. Military excellence is not democratic, Colonel Hayes continued. It is not achieved through participation trophies or lowered standards to accommodate different backgrounds and capabilities. In operational environments, there is no substitute for competence, and there are no second chances for failure. The message was clear: this week would separate those with genuine military potential from those who were simply going through the motions of the training program. Jessica felt her pulse quicken slightly, not with anxiety but with anticipation. After months of steady progress and positive evaluations, she was ready for a more serious test of her developing capabilities. The week's curriculum included advanced marksmanship training, tactical movement exercises, scenario-based decision-making, and what Colonel Hayes described as stress inoculation activities designed to evaluate performance under combat-relevant pressure. Jessica had limited experience with firearms beyond basic safety training earlier in the program, but her mechanical background gave her an intuitive understanding of the precision and consistency required for accurate shooting. During the first marksmanship session, trainees were introduced to various weapon systems and basic shooting fundamentals. Jessica approached the M4 carbine with the same systematic mindset she brought to any new piece of equipment, carefully studying its operation, understanding its mechanical principles, and practicing proper handling procedures until they became automatic. Her first shots were tentative and inconsistent, but as she developed a feel for the weapon's characteristics and refined her shooting stance and breathing techniques, her accuracy began to improve rapidly. Colonel Hayes observed all trainees closely during these initial sessions, offering technical corrections and noting individual progress, but his demeanor remained professionally neutral. Adequate improvement, he commented after reviewing Jessica's target scores. Continue focusing on consistency rather than trying to achieve occasional perfect shots. It was hardly enthusiastic praise, but Jessica detected no criticism either. She was meeting his standards, which seemed to be the goal at this stage of training. What she didn't realize was that Colonel Hayes had already formed preliminary opinions about her likely performance based on factors that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities. By Wednesday, the training had progressed to more complex exercises involving tactical movement, target identification, and shooting under time pressure. These scenarios required not just marksmanship skills, but the ability to make rapid decisions, move efficiently through varied terrain, and maintain accuracy while managing multiple stress factors simultaneously. Jessica discovered that the problem-solving skills and ability to work under pressure that she'd developed over months of training translated well to these tactical challenges. Her approach to complex shooting scenarios resembled her approach to diagnosing mechanical problems: systematic analysis, prioritization of critical factors, and methodical execution of solutions. During a particularly challenging exercise that combined marksmanship with tactical movement through a simulated urban environment, Jessica posted scores that placed her in the top 3 performers among the 8 trainees. Her accuracy was solid, her movement was efficient, and her decision-making under pressure showed the kind of composure that Colonel Hayes valued in potential combat personnel. But rather than recognition for superior performance, Jessica noticed that Colonel Hayes seemed increasingly skeptical about her results. His comments became more terse, his observations more critical, and his general demeanor suggested that he doubted whether her performance was sustainable under real pressure. "Beginner's luck can be misleading," he observed after reviewing her scores from the urban movement exercise. "Consistent performance over extended periods under varying conditions is what distinguishes competent personnel from those who simply had a few good days during training." The comment stung because it seemed to dismiss her improving performance as somehow illegitimate, but Jessica kept her response professional. She was beginning to sense that Colonel Hayes had reached conclusions about her potential that weren't based entirely on her demonstrated performance, but she was determined to let her results speak for themselves. Thursday's training introduced stress inoculation exercises designed to simulate the psychological pressure of combat environments. Trainees were required to perform marksmanship and tactical tasks while dealing with loud noises, time pressure, physical fatigue, and deliberate attempts to disrupt their concentration and composure. These exercises were where Jessica's months of training under Sergeant Chen's guidance proved most valuable. She'd learned to maintain focus despite distractions, to perform technical tasks while managing stress, and to recover quickly from mistakes without allowing them to affect subsequent performance. The mental discipline she'd developed served her well in Colonel Hayes' more demanding scenarios. But as Jessica's performance remained consistently strong despite the increased pressure, Colonel Hayes' skepticism seemed to deepen rather than diminish. His feedback became increasingly focused on potential weaknesses rather than demonstrated strengths, and his questions seemed designed to probe for signs that her competence was more apparent than real. Technical proficiency in training environments doesn't necessarily translate to effectiveness in operational situations, he mentioned during one feedback session. Sometimes the personnel who perform well in controlled conditions struggle most when faced with genuine uncertainty and consequences. Jessica was beginning to understand that Colonel Hayes' doubts about her capabilities weren't based on her performance during his training rotation. They were based on assumptions he'd made about civilian-trained personnel in general, and perhaps about her specifically. The realization was frustrating, but it also clarified what she needed to accomplish during the remaining days of the rotation. Friday's final exercise would be the most comprehensive and demanding of the week, combining all the skills and knowledge trainees had developed during the rotation into a complex scenario that would test their overall readiness for advanced tactical roles. Jessica approached this final challenge with determination to demonstrate that her performance throughout the week had been based on genuine competence, rather than luck or favorable conditions. What she didn't know was that Colonel Hayes had already decided she wasn't suitable for serious tactical responsibilities, and that he was prepared to create a situation that would expose what he believed were her fundamental limitations. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reveal exactly how wrong his assumptions had been. The final exercise of Colonel Hayes' rotation began at dawn on Friday, with conditions that seemed deliberately chosen to create maximum difficulty. A cold front had moved through overnight, bringing temperatures in the low 30s and a steady drizzle that made every surface slippery and reduced visibility across the training range. Jessica arrived at the equipment staging area to find Colonel Hayes briefing the 8 trainees on what he described as a comprehensive tactical assessment. Today's exercise will evaluate your ability to integrate all skills developed during this rotation under realistic operational conditions, he announced, his breath visible in the cold morning air. You will navigate a series of tactical challenges that require marksmanship, movement, decision-making, and stress management. Performance will be evaluated on accuracy, efficiency, adaptability, and overall mission accomplishment. The course layout was more complex than anything they'd encountered during the week. Multiple shooting positions at varying distances, obstacles requiring different movement techniques, time limits that demanded both speed and precision, and decision points where trainees had to choose between alternative approaches based on rapidly changing scenario parameters. Jessica studied the briefing materials carefully, noting the interconnections between different course elements and identifying potential strategies for optimizing her performance. What she didn't notice was Colonel Hayes watching her with particular attention, his expression suggesting that he'd already reached conclusions about how she would perform under genuine pressure. His skepticism about civilian-trained personnel had crystallized during the week into specific doubts about Jessica's readiness for advanced tactical roles, despite her consistent strong performance in all previous exercises. Thompson, he called as trainees prepared their equipment. You'll be running the course third in rotation. Use your waiting time to observe the first two runners and adjust your approach accordingly. It was standard practice to allow later participants to learn from earlier attempts, but something in Colonel Hayes' tone suggested this was more than routine instruction. Jessica nodded professionally, while wondering whether he was providing helpful guidance or setting up additional pressure by making her performance more visible to the group. The first trainee through the course was David Park, whose software engineering background had served him well throughout the tactical training rotation. He approached the challenges methodically, posting solid scores that demonstrated competent performance without exceptional results. His time was respectable, his accuracy adequate, and his movement efficient enough to complete all course elements successfully. Satisfactory performance, Colonel Hayes commented during the brief debriefing. Met all minimum standards and demonstrated appropriate tactical awareness throughout the exercise. The second runner was Alex Rivera, whose restaurant management experience had translated surprisingly well to tactical coordination and decision-making under pressure. She moved through the course with confidence, posted better accuracy scores than David, and completed the exercise well ahead of the maximum time limit. Good tactical execution, Colonel Hayes noted, demonstrated ability to prioritize objectives and maintain performance standards under time pressure. As Jessica prepared for her run through the course, she noticed Colonel Hayes positioning himself at a vantage point where he could observe her performance directly, rather than relying on range safety officers and electronic scoring systems. The additional scrutiny might have been standard procedure, but it felt like she was being evaluated more intensively than the previous runners. Jessica began the exercise by moving to the first shooting position, a prone stance at 300 yards that required precision marksmanship under time constraints. She settled into position with the systematic approach she'd developed during the week, checking her sight alignment, controlling her breathing, and squeezing off rounds with deliberate consistency. Her shots clustered tightly in the target's center ring, well above the minimum accuracy standards for the exercise. The second stage required tactical movement through simulated urban terrain, while engaging multiple targets at varying distances. Jessica approached this challenge with the same problem-solving mindset she brought to complex mechanical repairs, analyzing the terrain, identifying optimal movement routes, and prioritizing targets based on threat assessment criteria they'd learned during the week. Her movement was efficient and purposeful, her target engagement accurate and rapid, and her transitions between positions smooth enough to maintain momentum throughout the sequence. She was performing at the highest level she'd achieved during any training exercise, combining technical precision with tactical awareness in ways that demonstrated genuine competence, rather than lucky performance. But as Jessica progressed through the course, she became aware that Colonel Hayes was following her movement more closely than he'd observed previous runners. His presence felt intrusive and evaluative in ways that went beyond normal exercise supervision, as if he was looking for specific signs of weakness or failure rather than simply documenting performance. The third stage presented the most complex challenge of the exercise, requiring rapid decision-making between alternative tactical approaches, based on simulated intelligence updates delivered via radio during the exercise. Jessica received the briefing information, analyzed the tactical situation, and chose an approach that balanced risk management with mission accomplishment objectives. Her execution was flawless. She moved through the course section with precision timing, engaged all assigned targets with accuracy that exceeded minimum standards, and completed the sequence well ahead of schedule, while maintaining full situational awareness throughout the exercise. By any objective measure, her performance was superior to both previous runners, and represented the culmination of steady improvement throughout the rotation. Colonel Hayes' reaction was not what Jessica expected. Instead of acknowledgement or praise for exceptional performance, his expression remained skeptical, almost disapproving, as if her results were somehow suspect rather than impressive. "Interesting technique," he commented ambiguously, as she completed the course. "We'll discuss your performance during individual feedback sessions this afternoon." Jessica felt a disconnect between her demonstrated competence and Colonel Hayes' apparent reluctance to acknowledge it. She'd performed better than any previous exercise during the rotation, under more challenging conditions, with results that should have validated her readiness for advanced training opportunities. Yet Colonel Hayes seemed more doubtful about her capabilities than he'd been at the beginning of the week. During the lunch break, Jessica discussed the morning's exercise with Alex and David, comparing their experiences and trying to understand the evaluation criteria Colonel Hayes was applying to their performance. "You absolutely crushed that course," David observed. "Your accuracy was better than anyone else, your movement was textbook perfect, and you finished with time to spare." "I don't know what more he could want. Maybe that's the problem," Alex suggested. "Sometimes when you perform too well too quickly, people assume you're cutting corners or getting lucky. Maybe he thinks your performance isn't sustainable under real pressure." Jessica considered that possibility. Colonel Hayes had made several comments during the week about the differences between training performance and operational effectiveness, suggesting that he valued proven consistency over exceptional individual results. But she demonstrated consistent improvement throughout the rotation, not sudden lucky performance. The individual feedback session that afternoon would clarify Colonel Hayes' assessment of her potential for advanced tactical role. Jessica approached the meeting with confidence based on her demonstrated performance, but also with awareness that Colonel Hayes seemed to be evaluating her using criteria that went beyond objective measures of competence. Colonel Hayes' office reflected his military career with precision and economy. Commendation certificates, unit photographs and tactical manuals were arranged with geometric creating an environment that emphasized discipline, tradition, and institutional standards. Jessica sat across from his desk while he reviewed performance evaluations and exercise documentation. "Your technical performance during this rotation has been adequate," he began, a characterization that seemed to minimize results that had consistently exceeded minimum standards. "However, tactical competence requires more than the ability to perform well in controlled training environments." Jessica listened carefully, trying to understand the distinction he was making between her demonstrated performance and his assessment of her readiness for advanced responsibilities. Operational environments present
challenges that cannot be replicated in training exercises, Colonel Hayes continued. Personnel who excel in academic or controlled settings sometimes struggle when faced with genuine uncertainty, consequence and pressure. Military effectiveness ultimately depends on proven performance under actual stress rather than simulated conditions. The implication was that her success during the rotation was somehow artificial or misleading, achieved under favorable conditions that wouldn't exist in real military operations. Jessica found this assessment puzzling given that the training exercises had been specifically designed to simulate operational stress and evaluate performance under pressure. "I understand the importance of proven performance," Jessica responded carefully. "Could you help me understand what specific aspects of operational environments you think I haven't been adequately tested against?" Colonel Hayes paused, studying her with an expression that seemed to be evaluating not just her question but her entire approach to military training and development.
Civilian trained personnel often lack the institutional foundation that comes from traditional military development, he said finally. The discipline, commitment, and mental toughness required for combat roles are typically developed through years of progressive military experience, not 6 months of intensive training. Jessica began to understand that Colonel Hayes' assessment of her potential was based less on her demonstrated performance than on his assumptions about civilian backgrounds and accelerated training programs. He seemed to believe that genuine military competence required specific developmental pathways that couldn't be compressed or substituted regardless of individual capability or performance. I appreciate your perspective on traditional military development, Jessica said diplomatically. At the same time, I hope my performance during this rotation has demonstrated the kind of discipline, commitment, and mental toughness you're describing, even if it was developed through different pathways. Performance in training is one thing, Colonel Hayes replied. Performance when lives depend on your decisions and actions is something entirely different. The Advanced Technical Training Program produces competent support personnel, but combat roles require capabilities that cannot be developed through classroom instruction and simulated exercises. The dismissal was polite but definitive. Colonel Hayes had concluded that Jessica's civilian background and abbreviated training made her unsuitable for serious tactical responsibilities regardless of her objective performance during his rotation. His evaluation would recommend her for technical support roles rather than the advanced tactical training opportunities that her performance suggested she was ready to pursue. Jessica felt frustration building as she realized that Colonel Hayes had essentially disregarded her demonstrated competence in favor of preconceived assumptions about civilian-trained personnel. Her months of development, consistent improvement, and superior performance were being dismissed based on factors that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities. With respect, Colonel Hayes, she said, her voice remaining professional despite her growing irritation, I think my performance this week has shown that I can handle pressure and perform effectively under challenging conditions. I'd appreciate the opportunity to prove that in more advanced training rather than being limited based on assumptions about my background. Colonel Hayes' expression hardened slightly at what he apparently interpreted as inappropriate pushback against his professional judgment. Thompson, your confidence is noted, but overconfidence in personnel with limited experience is precisely the kind of attitude that creates problems in operational environments, he said with the tone of someone ending a discussion rather than continuing it. My recommendation will reflect my assessment of your appropriate role within the reserve system based on demonstrated capabilities and realistic evaluation of your development potential. The meeting was clearly over, and Jessica understood that arguing further would only reinforce Colonel Hayes' opinion that she lacked the judgment and institutional respect necessary for advanced military roles. She thanked him for his time and feedback, maintaining professional courtesy while internally processing the frustration of having her demonstrated competence dismissed based on biographical factors beyond her control. Walking back to the barracks after the feedback session, Jessica found herself questioning not just Colonel Hayes' assessment but the entire basis for evaluating military potential. She'd performed at the highest levels throughout the rotation, demonstrated consistent improvement over months of training, and shown the kind of adaptability and problem-solving ability that seemed directly relevant to tactical roles. Yet none of that mattered because she hadn't followed traditional military developmental pathways. That evening, Jessica sought out Sergeant Chen to discuss her experience with Colonel Hayes' rotation and get perspective on the evaluation she'd received. Sergeant Chen had become not just an instructor but a mentor whose judgment Jessica trusted, and she needed to understand whether Colonel Hayes' assessment was accurate or whether other factors were influencing his conclusions. They met at the base coffee shop, a neutral environment where they could speak more candidly than in formal training settings. Sergeant Chen listened carefully as Jessica described her performance during the rotation and Colonel Hayes' feedback about her readiness for advanced tactical roles. How do you think you performed this week? Sergeant Chen asked after Jessica finished her account. Honestly, I think I performed better than I have during any training exercise since arriving at Fort Braxton, Jessica replied. My accuracy was consistently above standards, my tactical movement was efficient and effective, and I handled all the decision-making challenges successfully. I feel like I demonstrated exactly the kind of competence Colonel Hayes said he was looking for. Sergeant Chen nodded thoughtfully. And how did Colonel Hayes respond to your performance? That's what I don't understand, Jessica said.
He seemed more skeptical about my capabilities as the week progressed, even though my performance was improving. His feedback suggested that my success in training doesn't predict success in operational environments, but I don't understand how else military readiness is supposed to be evaluated. Did he give you specific examples of deficiencies in your performance? Sergeant Chen asked. No, that's what was frustrating. He acknowledged that my technical performance was adequate, but he seemed to think that civilian background and accelerated training made me unsuitable for advanced tactical roles regardless of demonstrated competence. Sergeant Chen was quiet for a moment, considering her response carefully. Jessica, I need you to understand something about institutional bias in military settings. Some personnel, particularly those who develop through traditional pathways, have difficulty accepting that competence can be achieved through alternative routes. Colonel Hayes is an excellent tactical instructor, but he's also someone who believes strongly that military effectiveness requires specific developmental experiences. So his assessment of me was based more on his beliefs about training pathways than on my actual performance. That's possible, Sergeant Chen confirmed. But it's also possible that he's testing your response to adversity and institutional resistance. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can learn about personnel is how they handle situations where their competence is questioned or undervalued. Jessica considered this perspective. Are you saying this might be part of the evaluation process rather than a final judgment about my capabilities? I'm saying that military careers are full of situations where your competence will be questioned, your background will be scrutinized, and your readiness will be challenged by people who have the authority to affect your opportunities. Sergeant Chen explained. How you respond to those situations tells you and others a lot about your character and resilience. What would you recommend as an appropriate response? Sergeant Chen smiled. Continue performing at the highest level possible and let your results speak for themselves. Don't waste energy trying to convince skeptics through arguments, but don't allow their doubts to undermine your confidence in your own developing capabilities. Most importantly, remember that one person's assessment, even a senior officer's assessment, doesn't define your potential or limit your opportunities. The conversation helped Jessica put Colonel Hayes' evaluation in perspective, but it also clarified something important about her own development. She'd spent 6 months discovering capabilities she'd never known she possessed, building confidence through successful performance under increasingly challenging conditions. Colonel Hayes' skepticism was disappointing, but it couldn't diminish what she'd actually accomplished or learned about herself. More importantly, Jessica realized that she was no longer the uncertain civilian who'd arrived at Fort Braxton 6 months earlier. She'd developed not just technical skills and physical capabilities, but the kind of inner confidence that came from proving herself repeatedly under pressure. Colonel Hayes could question her readiness for advanced roles, but she knew what she was capable of achieving when properly challenged and supported. The final week of the advanced technical training program would include graduation exercises and career counseling sessions designed to help trainees identify optimal paths for continued development within the reserve system. Jessica approached these final activities with clarity about her own capabilities and determination to pursue opportunities that would allow her to continue growing regardless of institutional skepticism about her background. What she didn't anticipate was that Colonel Hayes' assessment would trigger a series of events that would give her the opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities under exactly the kind of pressure and consequence that he'd claimed she was unprepared to handle. Sometimes the best response to being underestimated wasn't argument or persuasion, but simply waiting for the right moment to prove that the skeptics had been wrong. The message arrived on Jessica's secure military email at 03:00 hours on Tuesday morning, 3 days before the scheduled graduation ceremony for the Advanced Technical Training Program. Emergency deployment notification required all personnel with tactical training certifications to report immediately for crisis response operations. A coordinated terrorist attack had disabled critical infrastructure at multiple military installations across the Southeast, and rapid response teams were being assembled from available qualified personnel. Jessica stared at her phone screen in the darkness of her barracks room, adrenaline replacing sleepiness as she processed the implications. This wasn't a training exercise or simulation. Real threats were targeting military facilities, and her months of preparation were about to be tested under actual operational conditions. The irony wasn't lost on her that Colonel Hayes had questioned whether her training performance would translate to real-world effectiveness, and now she was about to find out firsthand. The emergency briefing took place in the base's Secure Operations Center, a facility Jessica had never seen before that hummed with sophisticated communication equipment and digital displays showing tactical information from across the region. Major Patricia Reeves, Fort Braxton's operations officer, conducted the briefing with the kind of focused urgency that made clear this situation required immediate and decisive response. At 0200 hours, coordinated attacks damaged power infrastructure and communication systems at 4 military installations in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Major Reeves announced to the assembled personnel, "Initial intelligence suggests domestic terrorist organization with significant technical capability and inside knowledge of military facility vulnerabilities." The digital displays showed facility layouts, damage assessments, and current operational status for each affected installation. Jessica studied the information with the systematic approach she'd learned during training, noting patterns in the attacks and identifying potential vulnerabilities that might indicate future targets. Response teams will deploy immediately to secure affected facilities, restore critical systems, and establish operational continuity. Major Reeves continued, "Priority assignments will be made based on personnel qualifications and deployment readiness. All tactical certified personnel report to Colonel Hayes for team assignments and mission briefings." Jessica felt her pulse quicken at the mention of Colonel Hayes. Their last interaction had ended with his assessment that she wasn't ready for operational responsibilities, yet here she was being called upon to respond to exactly the kind of crisis situation he'd claimed would expose her limitations. The opportunity to prove him wrong was both exciting and intimidating. The assignment briefing revealed that Jessica would be part of a rapid response team tasked with securing and assessing the damage at Camp Morrison, a smaller installation that served as a regional training facility. The attack there had been particularly sophisticated, targeting both electrical systems and backup generators while simultaneously disrupting communication networks that connected the facility to broader military command structures. Colonel Hayes conducted the mission briefing with military precision, outlining tactical objectives, threat assessments, and operational protocols. His demeanor was entirely professional, focused on mission requirements rather than personal evaluations, but Jessica detected no change in his fundamental skepticism about her readiness for this type of assignment. "Team composition reflects available personnel rather than optimal selection criteria," he noted, a comment that seemed directed at Jessica and the other civilian-trained participants. "Operational effectiveness will depend on strict adherence to established protocols and recognition of individual limitations under stress." The team included 6 personnel with varying levels of tactical training and operational experience. Jessica was assigned as the technical specialist responsible for assessing infrastructure damage and coordinating repair priorities, a role that utilized her mechanical background while limiting her involvement in direct security operations. It was a reasonable assignment based on her training, but it also reflected Colonel Hayes' assessment that she wasn't ready for more demanding tactical responsibilities. The deployment to Camp Morrison began at dawn with helicopter transport that gave Jessica her first aerial view of military operations under genuine crisis conditions. The landscape below showed normal civilian activity continuing alongside the urgent military response, a reminder that real-world events didn't pause for training schedules or institutional evaluations. Camp Morrison appeared smaller and more vulnerable than Fort Braxton, with fewer security layers and infrastructure that seemed older and more exposed to disruption. The attack had been precisely targeted to maximize operational impact while minimizing the risk of casualties, suggesting sophisticated planning and detailed knowledge of facility layouts and systems. Jessica's initial assessment confirmed the intelligence briefing. Power systems had been damaged in ways that suggested technical expertise rather than random vandalism, and backup systems had been specifically targeted to prevent rapid recovery. The attackers had clearly understood military operational requirements and designed their sabotage to create maximum disruption with minimal resources. Preliminary damage assessment indicates coordinated attack on primary and secondary power systems, Jessica reported to Colonel Hayes over secure radio. Repair timeline will depend on availability of specialized components and access to undamaged distribution networks. Understood, Colonel Hayes replied. Maintain security awareness while conducting technical assessment. Intelligence suggests possible follow-up actions targeting response personnel. The warning proved prescient. As Jessica worked to catalog infrastructure damage and develop repair priorities, motion sensors around the facility's perimeter began indicating unauthorized activity in areas that should have been secured by the initial response team. The terrorist organization hadn't limited their operation to the initial attack. They were monitoring military response efforts and potentially planning additional strikes. Contact East Perimeter, came the radio call from Sergeant Martinez, the team's security leader. Multiple individuals in civilian clothing with tactical equipment appear to be conducting surveillance rather than preparing immediate attack. Jessica found herself in the middle of exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes situation that Colonel Hayes had claimed would expose her limitations. Technical assessment needed to continue to restore facility operations, but security threats required tactical response that might compromise the infrastructure repair mission. Real-world operations demanded the kind of rapid decision-making and multitasking under pressure that training exercises could only approximate. All personnel maintain current positions, Colonel Hayes commanded over radio. Technical assessment continues with enhanced security protocols. Prepare for possible hostile contact. Jessica's mechanical assessment had identified the critical path for restoring facility operations, but it required accessing electrical systems in areas of the compound that were now potentially under threat. The choice was between accepting operational delays that would extend the facility's vulnerability or proceeding with repair work despite security concerns. Colonel Hayes, this is Thompson, Jessica transmitted. Critical electrical access points are located near East Perimeter areas currently under surveillance. Repair work cannot proceed safely without resolution of security situation. Acknowledged, Colonel Hayes responded. Continue assessment from secure areas until tactical situation is resolved. But as Jessica reviewed her technical findings, she realized that waiting for complete security resolution would delay essential repairs by potentially 12 hours or more. The facility would remain vulnerable to additional attacks during that entire period, and other regional installations were depending on Camp Morrison's communication and coordination capabilities for their own security operations. The terrorist surveillance team had positioned themselves to monitor exactly the areas where critical repair work needed to occur, effectively using their presence to prevent rapid restoration of military capabilities. It was tactically sophisticated and demonstrated continued real-time intelligence about military response priorities. Colonel Hayes Thompson reporting, Jessica transmitted again. Delay in accessing critical systems will extend facility vulnerability significantly. Request permission to proceed with repairs under enhanced security protocols rather than waiting for complete threat resolution. Colonel Hayes' response revealed the complexity of operational decision-making under genuine crisis conditions. Thompson, that approach exposes repair personnel to unacceptable risk levels. Technical assessment indicates repairs can be completed once security situation is resolved. Respectfully, Colonel, technical assessment indicates that delay increases overall risk to mission success and personnel safety, Jessica replied. Facility remains vulnerable to additional attacks until power and communication systems are restored. The exchange highlighted the fundamental tension between security protocols designed to protect personnel and operational requirements that sometimes demanded accepting calculated risks to achieve mission objectives. Colonel Hayes was following established procedures for threat response, but Jessica's technical assessment suggested that strict adherence to those procedures was actually increasing rather than decreasing overall mission risk. Stand by for tactical assessment update, Colonel Hayes transmitted, indicating that he was consulting with higher command authority about how to proceed. During the delay, Jessica continued analyzing the infrastructure damage and developing more detailed repair timelines. Her assessment confirmed that the electrical systems could be restored relatively quickly once access was secured, but communication networks would require more extensive work that depended on coordination with regional service providers and military communication specialists. The tactical situation escalated when perimeter sensors detected additional movement, suggesting that the surveillance team was being reinforced or repositioned for possible direct action against the facility. What had begun as monitoring activity was potentially developing into a more serious threat to both the facility and response personnel. All personnel enhanced security posture, Colonel Hayes announced. Possible transition from surveillance to direct action by hostile forces. Technical operations suspend until tactical situation stabilizes. Jessica understood the security logic, but her analysis indicated that suspending repair work would leave the facility vulnerable for extended periods during which additional attacks would be more likely to succeed. The terrorists appeared to be using their surveillance capability to prevent restoration of military capabilities, effectively extending the impact of their initial attack through continued threat presence. Colonel Hayes, this is Thompson with updated technical assessment, she transmitted. Electrical systems can be restored in approximately 90 minutes once access is secured. Communication systems require 4 to 6 hours of work. Recommend prioritizing electrical restoration to reduce overall facility vulnerability even if security situation remains unresolved. Colonel Hayes' response was immediate and definitive. Thompson, you are not qualified to make tactical risk assessments. Technical operations will resume when I determine that security conditions permit safe access to critical areas. The comment stung because it dismissed not just her technical recommendation but her judgment about how technical and security considerations should be balanced under operational conditions. Jessica had spent months developing exactly the kind of integrated thinking that real-world military operations required, yet Colonel Hayes was treating her as if she were only capable of narrow technical assessment without broader operational awareness. But Jessica's assessment was proving accurate. Extended delays in restoring facility capabilities were creating exactly the kind of cascade effects that sophisticated terrorist operations were designed to produce. Camp Morrison's continued vulnerability was affecting regional coordination capabilities, which was compromising security response at other potentially threatened facilities. The tactical situation reached a critical point when intelligence updates indicated that the terrorist organization was planning additional strikes against military facilities while their initial attacks continued to degrade regional response capabilities. Camp Morrison's restoration had become not just a local priority but a regional security requirement that affected multiple installations and thousands of military personnel. All teams priority message from Regional Command, Colonel Hayes announced. Camp Morrison restoration is now classified as critical national security operation. All available resources and personnel are
authorized for immediate deployment to expedite facility recovery. Jessica understood that the situation had escalated beyond local tactical decisions to strategic military requirements. Regional commanders had determined that accepting calculated risks to restore Camp Morrison's capabilities was preferable to allowing continued degradation of regional security posture. Thompson, prepare for immediate access to critical electrical systems, Colonel Hayes transmitted. You'll have security escort, but repair work proceeds regardless of surveillance activity. Mission success now outweighs personnel security protocols. The authorization represented a complete reversal of Colonel Hayes's earlier caution about exposing technical personnel to security risks. Operational requirements had overridden his concerns about Jessica's readiness for high-risk assignments, though she suspected his confidence in her capabilities hadn't actually changed. Jessica gathered her repair equipment and prepared for what would be her first genuine test under the kind of pressure and consequence that Colonel Hayes had claimed would reveal her limitations. Real threats, real stakes, and real-time decision-making requirements that could affect regional military security operations. Moving toward the electrical access points under armed escort felt surreal after months of training exercises and simulated scenarios. The weight of her equipment, the tension in her security team's movements, and the knowledge that hostile forces were potentially watching her every action created a level of stress and focus that no training exercise had replicated. But as Jessica began working on the damaged electrical systems, she found herself entering the same kind of focused analytical state that had characterized her best training performances. The technical challenges required systematic diagnosis and methodical repair work, skills she'd been developing for months in increasingly complex scenarios. Her years of mechanical experience provided intuitive understanding of how the damaged systems should function, while her military training had taught her to work efficiently under pressure and adapt her approach based on available resources and time constraints. The combination proved effective as she systematically restored power to critical facility sections ahead of her estimated timeline. Electrical restoration proceeding ahead of schedule, Jessica reported. Primary power systems will be operational in approximately 45 minutes. Beginning assessment of communication infrastructure damage. Outstanding work, Thompson. Colonel Hayes responded, and Jessica detected what might have been genuine surprise in his tone. Continue with communication systems assessment while maintaining security awareness. The communication systems damage proved more complex and extensive than the electrical problems. Multiple network connections had been severed, backup systems had been specifically targeted, and some specialized equipment had been damaged beyond immediate repair. Restoring full communication capability would require not just technical work but coordination with regional service providers and military communication specialists. As Jessica worked through the communication systems assessment, she became aware that the hostile surveillance team was repositioning in ways that suggested they were preparing to interfere with her repair efforts. Their movement patterns indicated sophisticated understanding of facility operations and specific knowledge of which systems were most critical for regional military coordination. Security team, this is Thompson, she transmitted. Hostile movement patterns suggest they understand which systems I'm working on and may be preparing to prevent communication restoration. Recommend enhanced protection for communication equipment areas. Thompson, maintain focus on technical work, Colonel Hayes responded. Security team will handle threat assessment and response. But Jessica's analysis of both the technical requirements and tactical situation suggested that security and repair operations needed to be more closely coordinated. The terrorists were using their operational intelligence to maximize the impact of their attack by preventing effective response, and traditional separation between technical and security functions was playing into their strategy. Colonel Hayes' technical assessment indicates that communication restoration requires access to multiple facility areas over extended time period. Jessica reported, current security posture may not provide adequate protection for the full scope of repair operations. Explain your assessment, Colonel Hayes replied, his tone suggesting genuine interest in her operational analysis rather than dismissal of civilian-trained perspective. Jessica outlined how the communication systems damage had been designed to require repair work in multiple vulnerable locations, potentially exposing technical personnel to extended periods of risk while hostile forces maintained surveillance and positioning advantages. Effective restoration would require either eliminating the threat entirely, or developing alternative approaches that reduced exposure during critical work periods. Recommend coordinated tactical operation to secure all communication equipment areas simultaneously rather than sequential repair approach. She proposed. This would compress vulnerable time period and limit hostile opportunity to interfere with restoration efforts. Colonel Hayes was quiet for a moment, apparently considering her tactical recommendation. Thompson, that approach would require significant security resources and assumes you can coordinate repair work across multiple locations efficiently. Yes sir, I can coordinate multi-site repair operations, Jessica replied with confidence based on months of training in complex technical scenarios. Communication restoration can be completed in approximately 2 hours if security teams can provide simultaneous access to all critical areas. Stand by for coordination with security teams, Colonel Hayes transmitted. The decision to implement Jessica's tactical recommendation represented a significant shift in Colonel Hayes' assessment of her operational capabilities. He was not only accepting her technical expertise, but also her analysis of how technical and tactical operations should be integrated for optimal mission effectiveness. The coordinated security operation proceeded exactly as Jessica had proposed. Multiple security teams established simultaneous control over all communication equipment areas, while she moved efficiently between locations, implementing systematic repairs that restored facility communication capabilities within her predicted timeline. Communication systems restoration complete, Jessica reported as the final network connections came online. Camp Morrison is now fully operational and regional coordination capabilities are restored. Exceptional work, Thompson, Colonel Hayes responded, and this time there was no mistaking the genuine respect in his voice. Mission accomplished ahead of all projected timelines and under challenging security conditions. But the real test of Jessica's capabilities was yet to come. As facility operations were being restored, intelligence updates indicated that the terrorist organization had identified Camp Morrison's rapid recovery as a threat to their broader operational plan. Rather than withdrawing after their initial attack was neutralized, they were preparing a direct assault on the facility designed to eliminate the military personnel responsible for the successful response. All personnel immediate threat assessment, Colonel Hayes announced. Intelligence indicates possible direct attack on facility within the next 30 minutes. Enhanced defensive posture and preparation for combat operations. Jessica found herself in exactly the situation Colonel Hayes had claimed. She wasn't prepared for genuine combat conditions with immediate threats to personnel safety and mission success. Her technical work was complete, but the broader operation now required the kind of tactical response and performance under extreme pressure that he'd insisted required years of traditional military development. The attack began at sunset with coordinated strikes against facility perimeter defenses and security positions. The terrorist organization had planned their assault to exploit the gaps between successful infrastructure restoration and full defensive preparation, catching the response team during the vulnerable transition between technical and security operations. Contact multiple sectors came the radio reports from perimeter security teams. Organized assault with military-grade equipment and tactical coordination. Jessica was positioned in the facility's command center ostensibly to monitor technical systems and ensure continued operational capability during the defensive operation. But as the tactical situation developed, it became clear that the terrorist assault was specifically targeting personnel and equipment that had enabled the rapid facility restoration. Thompson maintained position in command center and coordinate with regional headquarters, Colonel Hayes instructed. Ensure communication systems remain operational regardless of tactical situation development. The command center provided Jessica with comprehensive tactical awareness through multiple communication channels and surveillance systems. She could observe the developing assault from security cameras, monitor team communications, and track the overall defensive operation as it evolved in real time. What she observed was that the terrorist assault was more sophisticated and better coordinated than the defensive response. The attackers had superior intelligence about facility layout and defensive capabilities, and they were systematically neutralizing security positions while advancing toward critical operational areas. Colonel Hayes, this is Thompson with tactical assessment, she transmitted. Hostile forces are advancing along routes that avoid primary defensive positions while targeting secondary security points. They appear to have detailed facility intelligence that's allowing them to exploit gaps in defensive coverage. Thompson maintained communication coordination and leave tactical assessment to qualified personnel. Colonel Hayes responded, but his tone suggested he was focused on immediate defensive requirements rather than dismissing her input. Jessica continued monitoring the tactical situation while maintaining regional communications, but her analysis indicated that the current defensive approach was reactive rather than strategic. Security teams were responding to terrorist initiatives rather than establishing conditions that would force the attackers into disadvantageous positions. The breakthrough moment came when Jessica realized that her technical knowledge of facility systems could be used tactically to create defensive advantages that the security teams weren't aware of. The electrical and communication infrastructure she'd repaired included capabilities that could be used to disrupt hostile operations while enhancing friendly force coordination. Colonel Hayes, this is Thompson with operational proposal, she transmitted. Facility systems can be configured to provide tactical advantages against hostile assault. Request permission to implement technical countermeasures while maintaining communication capabilities. What kind of countermeasures? Colonel Hayes asked, his tone indicating genuine interest despite the pressure of ongoing combat operations. Jessica outlined how the facility's lighting systems could be selectively controlled to create visibility advantages for defensive positions while compromising terrorist navigation and target acquisition. Communication systems could be used to broadcast disinformation that would confuse hostile coordination, and security systems could be reconfigured to provide enhanced situational awareness for defensive operations.
Implement immediately, Colonel Hayes authorized. All available advantages are authorized for defensive operations. Jessica began systematically reconfiguring facility systems to support the defensive operation, using her technical expertise in ways that her military training had never specifically addressed, but that her problem-solving capabilities enabled her to develop in real time. The electrical systems became tactical tools, the communication networks became weapons of confusion, and the security infrastructure became force multipliers for the defensive response. The impact was immediate and decisive. Terrorist assault coordination began breaking down as their communication was disrupted, and their navigation was compromised by selective lighting control. Defensive positions gained enhanced situational awareness that allowed more effective response to hostile movements, and the overall tactical balance shifted in favor of the military response. Hostile assault losing coordination, reported Sergeant Martinez. They're falling back to defensive positions and appear to be reconsidering their approach. Jessica's innovative use of facility systems had turned Camp Morrison's infrastructure into an integrated defensive capability that the terrorist organization hadn't anticipated and couldn't effectively counter. Their assault had been planned against a standard military facility, not against infrastructure that had been weaponized through technical expertise and tactical creativity. All teams maintain pressure on hostile withdrawal, Colonel Hayes commanded. Prevent organized retreat that might enable future operations. But the terrorist organization had one final tactical option that would test Jessica's capabilities under ultimate pressure. As their assault faltered, they shifted to a targeted strike against the facility's command center, attempting to eliminate the technical and leadership personnel who had enabled the successful defensive response. Command center under direct assault, came the security reports as hostile forces concentrated their remaining capability against Jessica's position. Multiple hostiles advancing on command center location with heavy weapons. Jessica found herself in the most dangerous situation of her life as the facility's command center became the primary target of a coordinated terrorist attack. The technical systems she'd been using to support defensive operations now needed to be reconfigured to protect her position while maintaining operational capability for the broader defensive mission. Colonel Hayes was approaching her position to coordinate the defense of the command center when the breakthrough occurred. Terrorist forces had penetrated the facility's inner defenses and were advancing directly toward the command center where Jessica was maintaining communication and technical operations. Thompson, prepare for evacuation from command center, Colonel Hayes ordered as he entered the facility. Security situation has become untenable for non-combat personnel. But Jessica's analysis of the tactical situation suggested that evacuating the command center would compromise the technical advantages that were enabling successful defensive operations. The facility systems required active management to maintain their tactical effectiveness, and abandoning that capability would surrender the advantages that had turned the tide of the battle. Colonel, recommend maintaining command center operations, Jessica replied. Technical systems require active management to sustain defensive advantages. Evacuation would compromise operational effectiveness. Thompson, you're not qualified for combat operations, Colonel Hayes stated definitively. This is exactly the situation I was concerned about when I assessed your operational readiness. It was the moment of ultimate test that Colonel Hayes had claimed would expose Jessica's limitations. Combat conditions, immediate physical danger, and decisions that affected not just mission success but personnel survival. Everything her months of training had prepared her for, but under circumstances that were more intense and consequential than any simulation. With respect, Colonel, I am qualified for whatever this situation requires, Jessica replied with calm confidence. I can maintain technical operations and defend this position if necessary. Colonel Hayes stared at her for a moment, perhaps recognizing that this was no longer about training evaluations or institutional biases but about immediate operational requirements and individual capability under ultimate pressure. The decision was made for both of them when terrorist forces breached the command center perimeter and began their final assault on the facility's operational heart. Colonel Hayes moved toward the defensive positions while Jessica maintained the technical systems that were providing tactical advantages to the overall defensive operation. But as Colonel Hayes positioned himself to coordinate the defense of the command center, he made a critical error in tactical judgment that would define both his career and Jessica's military future. Reaching for Jessica's M4 Carbine without authorization or coordination, he intended to provide her with additional firepower for the defensive operation. Jessica's response was immediate and decisive. Her months of tactical training, her innate understanding of operational requirements, and her commitment to mission success all converged in a single moment of perfect clarity and execution. Colonel Hayes found himself on the ground with a dislocated shoulder, staring up at Jessica Thompson, who was now holding her M4 Carbine with the kind of professional competence that left no doubt about her readiness for combat operations. "Colonel, with respect, I can handle my own weapon," Jessica said calmly as she moved to the command center's defensive positions. "Now let's finish this mission." What happened next became legendary at Fort Braxton and throughout the regional military command structure. Jessica Thompson, the civilian-trained mechanic who Colonel Hayes had deemed unsuitable for tactical roles, proceeded to engage 18 separate terrorist targets with precision marksmanship that eliminated the assault on Camp Morrison while maintaining operational control of the facility's technical systems. Her accuracy was flawless, her tactical movement was textbook perfect, and her operational awareness remained comprehensive throughout the engagement. She had become exactly the kind of military professional that months of intensive training were designed to develop, proving that competence could be achieved through multiple developmental pathways when natural ability met genuine commitment. Colonel Hayes, nursing his dislocated shoulder and his wounded pride, watched Jessica Thompson demonstrate capabilities that exceeded anything he'd achieved during his own military career. She wasn't just technically competent or tactically proficient, she was operationally brilliant in ways that integrated all aspects of military effectiveness into seamless performance under ultimate pressure. When regional reinforcements arrived to secure Camp Morrison, they found a fully operational facility defended by military personnel who had not only repelled a sophisticated terrorist assault but had done so using innovative tactical approaches that would influence future defensive doctrine development. Jessica Thompson was no longer the uncertain civilian who had arrived at Fort Braxton 8 months earlier. She had evolved into a military professional whose capabilities transcended traditional categories and whose performance under pressure had established new standards for what advanced technical training program graduates could achieve when properly challenged and supported. Colonel Hayes' formal report on the Camp Morrison operation included recommendations for Jessica's immediate promotion and assignment to advanced tactical roles, along with his own request for transfer to training positions that would better utilize his institutional experience while acknowledging that operational leadership required capabilities he no longer possessed. The terrorist organization responsible for the attacks was systematically dismantled over the following weeks, but their most significant impact had been unintended. They had created the conditions under which Jessica Thompson discovered exactly what she was capable of achieving when everything depended on her performance. 6 months later, Jessica stood before a new group of advanced technical training program participants as their primary instructor, sharing the lessons she'd learned about discovering hidden capabilities, overcoming institutional barriers, and proving that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources when talent met opportunity and preparation met challenge. Her story had become inspiration for military personnel throughout the regional command structure, but more importantly, it had become proof that the most dangerous assumption in military operations was underestimating what people were capable of achieving when their potential was properly challenged and developed. Colonel Hayes, now serving as a training doctrine development officer, occasionally attended Jessica's instruction sessions. His presence served as a reminder that even experienced professionals could learn important lessons about evaluation, assumption, and the multiple pathways that led to military excellence. The M4 Carbine that had been the focal point of their confrontation was now displayed in Fort Braxton's military museum, accompanied by a placard that read, "Sometimes the best response to being underestimated is simply demonstrating what you're actually capable of achieving." Jessica Thompson had discovered that her potential extended far beyond what anyone, including herself, had originally imagined. Her journey from small-town mechanic to military professional had proven that excellence was available to anyone willing to pursue it with dedication, courage, and the refusal to accept other people's limitations as their own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.